Tenassin, I be Sheikh Couture, I be Marcus Garvey, I be Kwame Ture, I be Shaka Zulu, I be Fela Kuti, I be Isaac Boro, I be Beko Kuti, I be the silence of the enemy, the lost bridges of we history, I be the roots of the family tree, the night for victory, oh they don't know, I be the people military, oh they don't know, General Seun Kuti, oh they don't know, I be the team of the Zulu spell, the beat of the drum to hear. So fella no fight for nothing, so Nkrumah no fight for nothing, so Sakara no die for nothing, so Stephen Biko no die for nothing. Remember the ones we die, remember the ones we fight for me, remember the ones we fight, remember the ones we die for me. Now we turn, now we must. Now we turn, now we must just let them know. For every lost one, there is a new one. Let them know. My revolutionary people. Till we free, you and me, then I go see the last revolutionary. Till we free, you and me, then I go see the last revolutionary. Till we free, you and me, then I go see, then I go see. Till we free, then I go see, then I go see, then I go see. Till we free, then I go see, then I go see, then I go see. Judges of justice, comfort and multiply us. Judges of humanity, comfort and multiply us. Judges of fraternity, comfort and multiply us. Judges of equality, comfort and multiply us. Judges of justice, multiply us. Judges of fraternity, multiply us. Judges of equality, multiply us. Judges of humanity, multiply us, yeah, just of justice. Multiply. They're not gonna see, they're not gonna see. Till we free, they're not gonna see. They're not gonna see, they're not gonna see. Till we free, they're not gonna see. They're not gonna see, they're not gonna see. Till we free, they're not gonna see. They're not gonna see. They're not gonna see. Of the enemy, the lost bridges of we history. I be the roots of the family tree, the night of a victory. Oh, they don't know. I be the people military. Oh, they don't know. General Seun Kuti. Oh, they don't know. I be the team of the Zulu spell, the beat of the drum to hear.
All right, good people. Hello, hello. Welcome, welcome, welcome. If you enjoyed that, that was the sounds of Nigeria's own Seun Kuti, one of the sons of Fela Kuti, who is one of my personal favorite artists. And I think that that song is particularly appropriate given the conversation that we're going to have today. If there were some names that you heard that you didn't recognize, take that as an invitation to do some research and check in and find out who some of those folks are. Be they Nkrumah, Sankara, Lumumba, and even your parents' revolutionary history if they got some. Definitely go check that out as well. But again, with that, I definitely want to say welcome to everyone that's here. I know more people will be coming in. I guess I should do this since we are in webinar mode. Welcome to the Dignity in Schools campaign's National Week of Action Against School Pushout. This is our national event, and I'm sure you're wondering, who am I? If you don't know, my name is Tafari Melisizwe. I am, among many other things, the communications coordinator for the Dignity in Schools campaign. And DSC is a coalition of over 100 organizations across 26 states, if I have the number correct, that, among other things, work to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. And of course, that means getting police out of schools. That means terminating contracts and relationships with law enforcement, with things that are like law enforcement in everything but the spelling of the name, so on and so forth. We are a coalition of parents, educators, students, lawyers, street folks, community folks, all dedicated to picking up the mantle of organizing in our communities to do the things that we are, destined to do. And so I am just overjoyed and happy to be here with you tonight to chat with one of my recent and hopefully long-term comrades, my brother Geo Maher, who I had the chance to meet virtually on Instagram and all that kind of stuff, but read his book, one of his books last year, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit, called The World Without Police. And given that the theme of this year's National Week of Action Against School Pushout is building the schools our communities deserve now, and some of our platform points being our Community Not Cops platform, again, talking about delinking relationships between law enforcement, police, institutions of policing. I thought that it would be really just appropriate to dig into a lot of the nutrition, for lack of a better word, that I got while reading Geo's book last year, and reached out, and we'll get into the formalities of bios and who people are and all that kind of stuff, but reached out and asked him if he would be willing to come and do a conversation and workshop with us around his work, and he was willing to do so. And so I'm glad that he said yes. I'm glad that we got some folks in the space to be able to facilitate and jump in this conversation together. A couple of house notes as we get started. This is a webinar. It's streaming live on YouTube as well. So I'll drop that link in the chat momentarily. You can share those links if people did not register. We encourage questions. You can use the Q&A section to pop in one. Two people already have. We'll try to tend to those questions as best as we can. But yeah, please participate. We're going to check in. We're going to chop it up. We're going to really get into a lot of good things. And to help assist me in having this conversation tonight, I brought in another DSC member, recent member to our coordinating committee, which is kind of the governing body, if you will, of the Dignity in Schools campaign, coming all the way from his chair in Austin, Texas. My brother Andrew, who will introduce himself a little bit. And then we'll toss it to Geo to kind of set things up, do the whole bio thing, and then get it rocking and rolling. So Andrew, welcome, and the floor is yours. Please let us know who you are, brother.
Thank you, Tafari and Geo and DSC, and so excited for the National Week of Action 2022. I'm Andrew Hariston. Like Tafari said, I'm a very proud member of the DSC Coordinating Committee. I'm a lawyer based in Austin. I work for Texas Appleseed, which is a public interest justice center based in the state capital, but that works across the state. And I direct the Education Justice Project for Texas Appleseed. I'm really excited for this conversation. I'll just stop there with my introduction, but yeah, thank you all for having me.
Definitely. No, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Andrew, for that, for sure. And just as a quick FYI, yes, I know a few people were asking. I see you in the chat, Aida. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, given that this is a webinar versus a meeting, there is not Spanish interpretation available like there typically is, unfortunately. But again, we will continue to do, for this particular event, but we will continue to host and do some things towards that end sooner rather than later, because absolutely it would be great to be having this conversation with our colleagues and comrades in that way as well. Of course, we can get to the business at hand now, and I will introduce Geo. So in short, Geo is a Philadelphia-based writer and organizer and visiting associate professor of global political thought at Vassar College. He's taught previously at Drexel University, my personal favorite place, San Quentin State Prison, to see that in there, and the Venezuelan School of Planning in Caracas, and has held visiting positions at the College of William and Mary's, Decolonizing Humanities Project, NYU's Hemispheric Institute, and the National Autonomous University of Mexico. He is co-editor of the Duke University Press series Radical Americas and author of 5 books: We Created Chavez, Building the Commune, Decolonizing Dialectics, A World Without Police, and Anti-Colonial Eruptions. And so that is a touch of who Geo is on paper, but you'll get to see more of it as we now toss the floor to him. So Geo, the floor is yours to share and chat as you see fit. We'll go for maybe about 35, 40 minutes to table set, and then get into some conversation with people in the chat and take it from there. So Geo, again, thank you and welcome.
Thank you all so much. I'm really excited to be here. Huge thanks to the Digging in Schools campaign for hosting this event, and I think it'll become clear, in the course of the conversation why schools are so important to the project of policing and of police abolition. So that's definitely something I think we should spend a lot of time on. I look forward to the comments and the conversation as well, and really digging into those questions, particularly of what it would look like to remove police from schools completely, as we move through our conversation. I like to start thinking about policing and police abolition, though, by insisting that deep down, we really all know what a world without police would look like. We've all helped, we've given help, we've given assistance, we've given aid, we've all required the aid of a stranger when we needed it. We all treat our family and our friends and our communities, in ways that don't require resort to the violence of the state and the armed violence of a special force of police, in our society. In other words, we all know on a micro level what it looks like to live without police, to exist without police, to solve our problems within communities, within families, by ourselves. And yet, for some reason, the idea of a world without police seems like a distant horizon. It seems like nothing seems further from our reality in the present. And one of the questions we need to begin with is why that is. Why is a world without police so unthinkable for us? And why is it so difficult for us to imagine what that world would look like? The first reason that we have a hard time imagining a world without police is because that's simply not the world that we live in, for the most part, right? We live in a world of police. And this is a very concrete phenomenon. This is not simply about ideology. It's not simply about our inability to envision an alternative, but we live in a world that concretely, materially is built around the police. We live in a world in which the police are presented as the only solution for all of our social problems. Mental health crisis, send in the police. No after-school activities for teenagers in the community, send in the police to harass them and send them home. And in so many ways, and aspects of our life, we see the police and we're presented with the police as the sole alternative and the sole solution. This is in part because the police work every day to naturalize and expand their power. And they've created, over the course of really a short period of decades, a situation in which this unimaginability is one of our greatest hindrances. The great science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin once said of capitalism, and we could say the same thing of policing, its power seems inescapable, but so too did the divine right of kings. In other words, things that are presented to us as inevitable, as unavoidable, and as eternal, more often than not, have been constructed. They have been built consciously by the hands of human beings, and they can be unbuilt and deconstructed as well. So how did we get here? How did we get to a situation in which we view trained professional violence workers, which is what the police are, violence workers, as the only solution to any and all social problems? In the US context, the main starting point for understanding this situation and how we got to where we are in the present is the failure of the Reconstruction Project. In other words, in the aftermath of the Civil War, when we had the formal abolition of slavery, in other words, for the most part, slavery was abolished. I say for the most part because we know perfectly well that the 13th Amendment leaves a sort of massive loophole that allows for the virtual enslavement of incarcerated people, or people who've been convicted of a crime. But if for the most part, slavery was abolished on paper after the Civil War during the Reconstruction period, the tearing down of that institution was not met with the building up of a social alternative. There was a project for this, of course. We call it radical reconstruction. Du Bois, spent 800 pages documenting this in an essential text, Black Reconstruction, that everyone should have read and should be reading. But he also documents the failure and the destruction of this project. What radical reconstruction sought to do was to rebuild American society from the bottom up in a way that would not require or rely upon or facilitate slavery or conditions similar to slavery. It sought to build a real society of social equality, of racial egalitarianism, to build a society in which everyone's conditions, the conditions of women, children, poor white workers, poor Black workers, everyone was being improved in a universal way. This project failed, I say failed, but the reality is that radical reconstruction was destroyed by white terrorism and white violence. And the name that we often give to that terrorism is the Klan. The Klan being the emergence of a vast betrayal by poor white people in the South in particular of their class interest, of their interest in creating a solidarity, creating solidarity with former slaves and building this universal alternative. And instead, you have the willingness of poor white people to become allies of rich white people, to become allies of their own oppressors and their own bosses and their own exploiters, and to engage as a result in vigilante violence and in terrorism that pushed back the Black franchise and that pushed back equality for generations. Now, simultaneous to this, and in the same historical breath, as it were, the emergence of the Klan goes hand in hand with the emergence of the police. It was the very same, in many cases, poor whites in the South who staffed the numbers and the ranks of the Ku Klux Klan, who then became police, who then used the very same kind of betrayal and the very same kind of class treason against formerly enslaved people, and who helped to build a system in which the old institution that had been torn down, ostensibly slavery, was replaced with new institutions. Mass incarceration, convict leasing, the racialization of crime and the criminalization of Blackness, the emergence, of course, of a legalized inequality and white supremacy known as Jim Crow. And all of these institutions become bridges to our present in the world of police. And what we see throughout that entire trajectory is the voracious expansion of police and of police power. The first thing that we know about the expansiveness of police power is that it goes well beyond the police. If the Klan and the police emerge hand in hand, and if white supremacist organizations today function hand in hand, we know perfectly well that policing is about far more than the police in uniform. We know that Ahmaud Arbery, that Renisha McBride, that Trayvon Martin were not killed by the police, but they were killed by white and white identifying vigilantes. We know that John Crawford was killed when a white bystander called 911 and lied about him having a weapon. We know that the grand jury that acquitted Darren Wilson for the murder of Mike Brown, was part of this, what I refer to as the pig majority. In other words, the various ways in which, far beyond policing, you have this institutionalized and uninstitutionalized informal coalition and majority that does the work of the police. As Du Bois showed more than 100 years ago now, this broad pig majority extends to encompass even whiteness itself. All, as Du Bois put it back, again, referring back to a period nearly 150 years ago, he said, all white people in the South were the police, and the police represented and stood for all white people. And the echoes of this history really resound today when we think about these cases. The police have historically expanded even beyond whiteness as well, right? And this is something more recent, of course, in the past few decades, in the ways in which communities of color and community leaders and church leaders were conscripted into the project of policing. And here, of course, thinking particularly of the 1994 crime bill, the mass incarceration crime bill, the brutal imposition of mass incarceration and the expansion of police through the sort of arm twisting that to some degree voluntary and some degrees much less so, incorporated non-white populations into this broad project of policing. We've seen concretely the expansion of policing in recent decades. We've seen the exponential expansion of budgets up into and including nationwide, something along the orders of the trillions of dollars. We've seen the sheer numbers of the police expand over the past 60 years in particular. We've seen some cities triple their police budgets during that period, triple the concrete number of police, uniformed police in our cities over that same period. The expansiveness of the world of police also involves the police taking over new realms of life. Here primarily and fundamentally schools. There were no school police for the most part 60 years ago. This is a relatively new phenomenon. And yet it's a phenomenon that for whatever reason, we now today have a hard time imagining life without, right? Imagining a world in which schools are not fully either protected from external threats in the case of sort of white suburban schools, or policed internally, policing the student body as themselves representing a threat, as the case in many poor and working class communities of color and their schools. Policing expanded starting in the 1960s in particular into schools, and that expansion has ramped up dramatically in recent decades. Police took over public libraries, they took over public transit, they took over medical institutions, public and private. Not only do have police entered these spaces, not only has the world of police sucked in and absorbed spaces that formerly did not have police in them, but these spaces and these institutions have also become part of what many abolitionist scholars and activists refer to as carceral expansion. In other words, the ways in which these institutions have become part of policing, the way that social work, the way that CPS, for example, have become part of the policing and incarceration apparatus. The ways that schools, and here we talk about the school to prison pipeline as though in some ways the two were a separate phenomenon, but the more schools are policed, the more they become policing institutions, the more they become embedded in the institutions of mass incarceration, the pipeline becoming, as a result, more of a spectrum than even a pipeline. This world of police extends to the border as well and beyond it. The world of policing, the expansion of policing in the United States is in fact synonymous with the expansion of the US border southward and westward. And here we could talk about the role of sort of quasi-vigilante organizations like the Texas Rangers in seizing and helping to seize the Southwest from northern Mexico and helping to dispossess those people in those territories. And today, of course, playing a role in policing not only brown migrants, but also Black migrants at the southern US border, as we've seen in dramatic fashion recently with Texas Rangers on horseback, with bullwhips assaulting and attacking migrants. In other words, the police expand westward as the US border expands westward, doing their same informal vigilante work that they did with the Klan and that they do today when they engage in quasi sort of lynching of migrants, of poor Black and brown people throughout the US. The world of police extends far beyond the US border in global US imperialism, which is itself a form of policing. And there's all sorts of new research showing the tight collaboration historically between US imperialist military interventions and policing. This involves not only the trading of technologies, and we've seen, of course, very clearly with the 1033 program since 2001, since September 11th in particular, the massive infusion of military technology into US policing, but that's always also been a two-way street in which the military has engaged in policing activities and understood itself as engaging in policing, specifically in, for example, imperial intervention in Vietnam and beyond. Between the military and the police, there is a tight relationship, and so-called insurgent populations within the US, in other words, again, poor Black and brown communities have always been treated as insurgents. They've always been treated as subject to military force. While people were very shocked, and I think rightly shocked, to see tanks rolling through the streets of Ferguson in 2014, 2015, that's always been the case when it comes to so-called insurgent communities, when it's been the case of the Black Power movement and the kinds of policing and the kinds of violence they've always been subjected to. The expansion of policing has included informal policing, private policing, which now outnumber uniformed police in the United States. And this too has a parallel overseas with the dramatic expansion of military contractors and mercenaries overseas that operate with even greater impunity than even uniformed and official officers. This is the world of police. It is an expanding world, the ultimate horizon of which is the total impunity of police and total obedience for the rest. It's a system of enforced inequality and hierarchy that can only be described as a form of fascism. We'll come back, I think, to that question. Paradoxically, the expansion of policing across society and beyond does not and has not corresponded in any way with what is the apparent stated function of the police, namely to protect and to serve. This isn't really a paradox at all, given what we know about the police, though. It's built into their history as slave catchers, as enforcers of class inequality. But it's worth maybe rehearsing some of the important details of who the police protect and serve and who they don't. And in the book, I engage in this sort of like subtractive process where you just start taking away communities who are not really protected by the police. And in the end, you realize there are not many people left. Of course, we know that the police don't protect communities of color, that depending on what community we're talking about, the police are either twice as likely or 3 times as likely to kill you if they engage in some kind of interaction with you. We know that the police do not protect the poor. You don't call the police to protect an apartment that you don't own. You can't call the police, and you wouldn't call the police to enforce student loans that you don't pay. If you don't have property, if you don't have wealth, then there's nothing that the police are going to help you do and help you protect. The largest constituency, however, and this is often overlooked, so it's worth emphasizing, the largest constituency that is left unprotected by police is women. Not only is it the case that, and here we have one of the main sort of red herrings of police discourse is to say, well, what do you do with people who engage in sexual assault? What do you do with the rapist? This is a sort of extreme argument for the need for policing. And yet when you look concretely, you realize that the police do absolutely nothing to prevent or even deal with in the aftermath of sexual assault. When survivors are not mocked and ridiculed and blamed when they're reporting an assault, there are hundreds of thousands of rape kits that go untested, and we know that, and it continues to this day. And the actual, even if we thought that arresting, convicting someone for sexual assault was actually a preventative measure that would help survivors in the future, which is not itself true. Even if we thought that was true, the percentage of sexual assaults that actually reach that point of conviction is something on the order of 1%, a tiny fraction, right? And we need to add to this and understand the fact that it's not simply about police not protecting women, but it's about the concrete harm that police do to women. And this takes both the form of, on-duty assaults, sexual assaults, coercion, sexual coercion, brutality, but it also very crucially includes off-duty, right? Some, according to self-reporting statistics, in other words, police themselves, confessing and speaking on this, 40%, some 40% of police officers are domestic abusers. 40%. In other words, when they're out of uniform, in other words, not protecting women on the job, many are engaged in inflicting violence upon women. And so it's not hard to conclude that police inflict and cause more violence to women than they actually prevent. On top of these, so we've got communities of color, poor communities, women, sex workers are systematically harmed and left unprotected by the police. The homeless population is systematically harmed and subject to dramatically high levels of violence from the police. And probably the most shocking statistic has to do with those who are suffering a mental health crisis. And here the numbers are absolutely astounding. You are 16 times more likely to be killed by police if you're suffering a mental health crisis. And that cuts across race, although it correlates pretty heavily with class and with race as well. And so we reach a situation where you think to yourself, how many people are left to be protected by the police? At the very basic level, you could say rich white men would be protected, but how many of them, of course, have family members who would be subject to that violence, whether it's women or queer or trans children who will be subjected to police violence, or who have people in their family who are people of color. All of this points to the fact that the constituency protected by the police is really far smaller than we are led to believe. And part of what we need to understand and deal with is the fact that this gap between who is protected and served versus the ideology that they tell us about what it is that the police do. The world of police, this expanding world, this world that doesn't actually protect communities, is not without resistance, however. Part of what we need to do, and what has been done in the past few years, is this process of denaturalizing the expansion of the police, not taking it for granted, not granting it the status of an eternal and immutable situation, and instead questioning it, pushing back on it. We are only talking in the way that we are about police defunding and police abolition because of movements in the streets contesting these questions, pushing back, making it absolutely imperative that even political leaders take seriously the question of policing and the crisis of the police. We need to show that it wasn't always this way and that it need not be this way in the future. And it's these militant movements in the streets that have reminded us of this. And it's from the basis of those movements that I wrote this book, particularly the movements in Minneapolis, which cast onto the mainstream stage and the debate stage of the Democratic Party the question of defunding the police and indeed of their abolition. There's widespread recognition as a result of these movements that policing is in crisis, but the response to this crisis is most often reform. One of the main arguments of this book, though, and there's an entire chapter on it, is that policing simply can't be reformed. And it's in part because policing has only been reformed from the very beginning. It's been a long process of reform. From the moment that the police were established in the US in particular, they were always in a process of reform because they were always in a legitimacy crisis, because they were always committing brutality, because they were always engaged in corruption. And so what we look at today and we see these proposals for police reform, we see that they're almost identical to the reforms proposed more than a century ago. The existing menu of reforms, the package of reforms from Obama all the way back, has little to offer in the way of real change. And again, here it's worth maybe cataloging some of the proposals put forward. We hear about body cameras, right? This sort of technological fix to policing. Body cameras do not reduce the violence of the police. If anything, there are studies showing that body cameras can increase violence by police of up to 40%, because the police believe quite rightly that the footage provided from their vantage point, footage that is pointed at someone that they are engaging with, who is then charged with a crime often, that it will validate their and vindicate their own decisions and their decision to use violence. Body cameras do not help with police violence. We hear a lot about training, right? If only we train police right, then then somehow they would be less likely to use violence. That's simply not true either. Derek Chauvin was incredibly highly trained. He was trained for thousands of hours in racial sensitivity and the use of force. He trained others, and yet that didn't stop him from putting his knee on George Floyd's neck. Police training does not fix the problem, because the police are sent into the community to do a job, and that job is to uphold white supremacy and to uphold class inequalities. The refrain about community policing, of course, goes back to the 1960s and beyond, but this has never been about anything more than fragmenting the power of the community, than weakening the community, police infiltrating themselves into communities and preventing the coherence of the kind of community strength that would serve as a true buttress against that policing. The only community that policing seeks to foment and develop is a community of snitches and a community of bootlickers. These reforms simply don't work. The reforms, the technological fixes, the increased funding for training, this has never changed the way that policing functions, because it doesn't change what it is that their function does. The diversification of police has been going on for more than 100 years. This does not prevent violence either. If anything, there are studies that show that women, that officers of color are sometimes more likely to be violent because they need to prove themselves on the streets to be capable of doing a brutal and a violent job. Policing cannot be reformed. Policing is reform. And the function of that reform, more often than not, is to legitimize the police, to clean up their image, which is what we're seeing right now, and to encourage us to believe and to forget about all of this talk of defunding and of abolition. When we're thinking about the failure of reform, this is where we really can draw some important lessons from the past. The past failures, the failure of Reconstruction, and this becomes incredibly crucial for looking forward. This is precisely why when we read the work of great abolitionist comrades and scholars, from Angela Davis to Ruthie Gilmore, Mariam Kaba, and others, we find so much of this discourse centering what is often referred to as presence versus absence, right? Abolition is not about taking away, abolition is about building up. It's not simply about tearing down, it's about building new communities that would be strong enough to not require the police. In other words, we're talking about a process of making carceral institutions, prisons, but also the police, obsolete, in the words of Angela Davis. What does it mean to make an institution obsolete? It means to build a world in which that institution is not necessary, in which it doesn't make any sense, and in which it is not required for the functioning of society. Which is all to say that if we could snap our fingers and abolish the police tomorrow, there would be new police the next day. They may have a different name, they may call themselves something different. There would be private police, there would be rich people absolutely scared, and so they would hire their own police. Why? Because we live in a world of economic inequality where rich people need to protect their wealth. We live in a world of racial inequality where white people are scared as hell and they feel like they need to protect themselves from this sort of imaginary threat. We live in a world of gendered violence in which, not only on the one hand, on the sense of women being subject to, to violence that they need protection from, but also the sort of misogynistic violence that becomes part of policing, right? The kind of bullies that seek out these jobs and these positions. That's the kind of world that we live in. In a world that looks very different from that, in a world in which people have everything that they need to survive, land, food, shelter, in a world without systematic inequalities to protect, to uphold, and to patrol, why on earth would we need the police? This means that, in a way, abolition is this sort of clumsy process of walking on 2 feet, right? Tearing down existing institutions, repressive institutions, carceral institutions, and building up alternatives. Dismantling as we establish new alternatives slowly and in a piecemeal fashion. More often than not, these move in very specific directions, right? You're building up small, what we could call prefigurative alternatives that look like the new world all around us in community centers and community organizations, very, very slowly. And we're constantly struggling to try to get an opportunity to tear down repressive institutions in the process. Minneapolis showed us that this tempo, this pace could shift dramatically when there are people rebelling in the streets and pushing these alternatives very quickly. Not only was there the very real possibility of dismantling the Minneapolis police, which very nearly came to fruition, but on the ground during the Minneapolis rebellions in 2020, the police disappeared. And so people got together, they formed networks, communication networks, security patrols, all the things that they required to keep themselves safe. And they established a phone tree or a WhatsApp group of 1,100 people as a way of coordinating, communicating, and maintaining this new alternative police-free space. So they were able to do that incredibly quickly. That's not normally how it happens, but it shows us as well that it is possible. Concretely, and I'll try to move a little more quickly. If we're talking about abolition as always requiring a tearing down and a building up, in other words, abolition is always hand in hand with the project of reconstructing society. One of the questions that we have is, what do these two gestures look like today? The first I argue in the book is breaking police power, political power of policing, the expansive, fascistic, trajectory of the police to take and seize more space, more territory, and more impunity every year. This starts with obliterating the power of their fake unions, and I call these fake unions for a reason. These are not labor unions, the so-called police unions, the Fraternal Order of Police, the benevolent associations. These are organizations that have sold whatever sort of fake autonomy they had off to the ruling class so that they could be its protectors and provide an adjunct to the functioning of the state. Dismantling those unions, making their function impossible, involves a whole range of struggles today. So, I mean, just roughly what these police unions do is that on the local level, they engage in direct negotiation with city officials. And when you look for police impunity and the rules that govern police action, and when you think about, whether or not police are being charged, after they commit violence or commit murder, it has everything to do with these negotiations. These negotiations lay out how it is that police are to be held responsible, how their disciplinary functions work, how their disciplinary proceedings work. They often require police departments and cities to file charges against them, disciplinary proceedings, incredibly quickly, within a few days or 30 days. And they often allow those disciplinary records to be scrubbed or wiped after a year. So you have abusive cops being recycled through these forces all over the place. And there are many, many, many examples of this. They give the police extra special due process rights to protect themselves from any accountability, whether it's from city officials or criminal prosecution. You had situations like the Baltimore rebellions, where Freddie Gray is killed by police, and even the mayor was complaining, and I don't think she gets too much credit, but she was complaining kind of rightly that the way that the union negotiations had been carried out, and specifically the kinds of laws that they had put in place, made it very hard to prosecute these cops. And that's true, because the other thing these police unions do is they push through what are called law enforcement officer bills of rights, state level laws that make it almost impossible to discipline police, that give them, again, special rights, extra constitutional privileges that everyday citizens don't have. So that we know perfectly well, if we go out and kill someone, we'd be arrested, we'd be charged, but this is precisely the reason this doesn't happen with, with officers. I see Zakiya saying that they repealed that in Maryland. I hope so, because Maryland was, I hadn't heard about that. Maryland was actually one of the worst, examples of a law enforcement officer bill of rights. And we here in Pennsylvania, we're trying to push. It's very difficult, though, in the Pennsylvania situation, to repeal the law that requires local city officials to negotiate directly with police unions, because that's built right into the law. It makes it hard for the city to break that off. So break police power, first of all. Weaken the functioning of police. And this involves identifying potentially radical or even abolitionist reforms that weaken the police, that are not reforming the police, but reforming a society in a way that helps to break their power. Here, abolitionists, you may hear talk a lot about abolitionist reforms versus reformist reform, right? And this is because we're in a situation where we need to talk about change. We need a way of thinking about change. Not all change is immediately going to create the society that we need to live in, but we need to have a way to navigate the changes that are possible on the table and to distinguish between the ones that we should support and the ones that we don't. Mariam Kaba has done great work on this, and developed a list, for example, of reforms that could be supported and those that should not be. The rough distinction being any reform that reinforces the power and the legitimacy of the police, that gives them more funds, that gives them more technology, that gives them bigger budgets for training, that provides more officers, that provides more attention to diversification. All of these programs should be opposed. What we can support are any changes and small reforms that weaken the function of the police, that weaken, of course, their budgetary strength, right? That in here defunding, of course, is crucial. I'll turn back to that in a second. That weaken their power, that increase oversight on police, in significant ways. And here we're not talking about the kind of toothless civilian review boards that have no actual authority. We're talking about real oversight that really has the power, to impose some kind of control and discipline on the police. There's a lot of debate about defunding, but the major, of course, on the one hand, the most important element of defunding the police is the reduction of contact between police and the community. If you pull the police and withdraw the police out of communities, then you have less violence being inflicted upon those communities. Then you have less policing going on, less contact, and anything you can do to reduce that contact is something that could be supported. But the real genius of defunding, despite not being an immediate revolutionary measure, is that the point of defunding is also to refund alternatives. It's to demand that money in city budgets that is actually money that's been looted from these communities and removed from these communities and handed over to the police. We're not asking for handouts from the city. We're saying that is our money that the city has already taken and is earmarking for repressing the very same communities that are being systematically looted. The real advantage is to take that money and reinvest it in community alternatives, right? Because then we can point to a situation in which, say, you defund the police by $5 million. First of all, when you see that your communities don't get any more dangerous, when you see that they don't get any more violence, when you see that the alternatives that can be funded and supported are actually doing very good work to reduce violence, and I'll talk about that in a second, then it's much easier to say and begin to think and begin to look at police budgets and say, these are bloated, these are useless, these are not making us safer. This question of defunding, though, goes hand in hand with the second piece. In other words, the reconstructive piece of police abolition. The police that involves, the piece of abolition that involves building up alternatives, building a new world in the shell of the old, establishing new community relationships, and, or rather, and better put, continuing to develop and continuing to strengthen those community organizations that already exist. This is why in the book, I describe the world without police as a real, living, breathing thing. It's already there. We know what it looks like, but also we have organizations that reflect it. We have organizations that exist and function to keep communities safer, to provide social cohesion, to engage, to disrupt violence before it happens, to de-escalate, to bring people into conversation with one another within communities. And we have, of course, a range of community organizations and demands that seek to develop more egalitarian, communities that will not require policing. So part of the task is plugging into these organizations, demanding that those resources that are defunded are funneled into, preferably not government organizations, but community level organizations, right? Direct intervention, violence prevention programs, which have proven incredibly effective in preventing violence, in deflecting violence from reaching from breaking out into actual sort of death, and have done so in a way that's infinitely more effective than the police themselves. The task is to stitch together these community organizations, to strengthen them, to devote more resources to them, and create a broad fabric of community by demanding that the community be given resources to govern itself. And this goes all the way from the level of defunding, where you're demanding something of local leaders, and that may be resources into community organizations or others. But it also involves building relationships on the very micro level, on your block, in your neighborhood. It could involve building a text thread or a WhatsApp thread to communicate with your neighbors. Either if you see the police coming into the community, people can show up, keep an eye on the police, make sure they're not engaging in any sort of misconduct or violence on the community. But here's the trick: that same communicational structure that you can establish with neighbors can provide an alternative to the police entirely, right? If you have a dispute on the block, if you have conflict between neighbors, if you have someone in the neighborhood who is engaging in violence or stealing or burglarizing homes, you can engage through the neighbors and through the community organization that you're able to develop from the ground up. And here's the main difference between that and calling the police. When you call the police do not treat that person as a valuable member of the community. They do not understand that that person that may be causing a disruption in the community might also be someone's child, someone's grandchild, someone's neighbor, someone's friend, someone's lover. All members of the community are valuable, and community organizations are much better at grasping that fact than the police as a professional outside force. One of my main arguments in this book, and I haven't gotten a chance to talk about it too much today, is that this abolitionist vision of a world without police is also a transnational vision. It also emphasizes the domestic and the global elements of what that world of police is and has been, of the border and of global US imperialism abroad. And so we need to locate not only policing, but also struggles for abolition, struggles for communities without police on a global terrain. It allows us to think bigger and think smarter about what abolition really is. It allows us to look at community alternatives. And I look a lot in the book at communities in Mexico or in South Africa or Venezuela, where people have, people in the direst of circumstances, right? People in some of the most dangerous parts of the world, the most dangerous neighborhoods, because that's not an excuse when it comes to these questions, right? The most dangerous neighborhoods, people sat down and said, you know what, the police are not keeping us safe. We can do it better. And that is, it may seem paradoxical, but it actually makes perfect sense, right? Those who are most abandoned by our system, those who are left most vulnerable by that system, we cannot expect the police to protect those people. And those are precisely the people on the global level who have, taken up the means of defending themselves and defending their communities against violent elements, but also against the police simultaneously. And this global vision also allows us to think about and build bridges. These are already being built between prison abolitionists, police abolitionists, and border abolitionists. And those modes of policing the border, whether it's ICE or Border Patrol, which emerged and developed hand in hand with the police that oppress communities of color, poor communities within the US, are the same ones and with the same political outlook and the same mechanisms policing the border, imprisoning migrants, and engaging in the same kind of mass incarceration. To be an abolitionist means, in short, choosing and making a choice between what I call democracy and the police, because the police are a radically anti-democratic force. W.E.B. Du Bois, going way back, spoke of different kinds of democracy, and he spoke of a very interesting and important category, which is that of abolition democracy. By this, Du Bois meant, what kind of democracy can we build with slavery abolished? What kind of democracy can we build if we push back the bounds of white supremacy, if we push back the economic bounds of capitalism? And he was arguing that we build a much more thorough understanding of democracy, a much more radical understanding and substantial understanding of democracy. And it's no accident then that the police are the opposite of this. They emerged out of the destruction of that vision. They emerged out of the destruction of Reconstruction and the resurgence of the Klan. And they continue to do the same work as the Klan today. The overlap, in other words, between organized white supremacy and the police is no accident at all. And this hasn't changed over the years. We know perfectly well that the police are fully engaged in the project of white supremacy. Not only are they members of overtly white supremacist and neo-fascist organizations, there's been a lot of talk lately about the Oath Keepers, about the Proud Boys, about the 3%ers, and the overlap between police and these organizations is actually fundamental and significant. But it's not simply because these organizations have weaseled their way into the police. It's because the police are a petri dish where white supremacy, where authoritarianism, and where fascism are cultivated. While the police are against even the most limited forms of democracy, they're constantly trying to push back on what little democracy and what little oversight we have, meaning that it's high time that we choose between democracy and the police. The police today operate as a gang. They operate as an organized extortion ring to blackmail local city officials for ever-increasing budgets while providing nothing in return. They're a budgetary shakedown. They represent a protection racket that doesn't protect. When they aren't engaging in the open theft of asset forfeiture, and people probably know that the police steal more resources through asset forfeiture than are lost through burglary in any given year. When they're not doing that, they're strong-arming cities for ever expanding budgets or to buy new and more violent toys. And the question is, what do we do about this? And so I ask you all, and this is just sort of how, looking forward, I ask people to envision, right? There's a violent gang roaming the streets, terrorizing the population. This gang is killing more than 1,000 people a year. Would you negotiate with it? Would you talk about how best to reform it? And the answer, of course, is that you wouldn't. You would abolish it. And that's exactly what we should do with the police. Thank you all. I'm super glad to be here again, and really excited to engage in some of the the many questions that have already been raised. I can see, and to think through these questions really in collaboration with you all, and of course with with an emphasis as well on the question of where to start. And I think schools are a great place to start.
Geo, I want to thank you for that beautiful and necessary grounding, both in history and in the revolutionary possibilities of the present. I'm so glad that you mentioned folks like Mariam Kaba, Ruthie Gilmore, and Angela Davis, really these Black women pioneers who have been calling for the abolition of the police state and prisons for so long. And as I read your book, I thought about We Do This Till We Free Us, and particularly the chapter around arresting the carceral state. And a beautiful thing for me as a young lawyer coming into the DSC network in 2017 and being a little bit more seasoned in 2022 was thinking about how this coalition really uplifts the voices of impacted parents and young people. And we see these examples as you ended your remark, right? So in arresting the carceral state, there was a 12-year-old student in Texas who was charged with a misdemeanor for spraying perfume on herself. And then in California, there was a 16-year-old who was having cake. It fell on the ground and then ended up with a broken wrist from the police, right? And so I think folks feel it intently that abolition can be felt and won in the school context, right? And we've seen that in the wake of George Floyd and the 8 to Abolition platform, for example. And my question is, as you were drafting the book and kind of thinking about the revolutionary possibilities of the summer of 2020, how they kind of factor in, and where we're at this moment where a school district like the Oakland Unified School District voted to end its school police department in 2020, but we're already seeing that pushback, right? That kind of retrenchment to policing in another name, as you lifted up. What's kind of the thought, from your perspective in 2022 is we're getting some victories, but they're quickly being followed by regressive policies.
Thank you so much for the question. And that's, I didn't, talk about this too much, already, but the reality is that we're living in a world, in a moment of counterinsurgency, right? The past 2 years have been open counterinsurgency. What does that mean? Well, the first point to remember is that it means that we, dominated the narrative in 2020. If people remember the presidential, debates, the Democratic Party debates, almost every candidate was advocating defunding the police. And by, a quirk or by the machinations of the Democratic Party machine, of course, we got candidates who were far more sympathetic with the status quo, a former DA and a former segregationist, so you've got a situation, of course, which pushes back hard against these demands, but which is needed to continue pushing. And so, I think there's a lot of, people who would say, well, look, like the tide is turned back against abolition, right? Look at Eric Adams, or you look at Joe Biden saying, no, we're refunding the police. But then you have to ask yourself, why does Joe Biden have to say we're refunding the police? It's because of how much headway was made in 2020 in terms of consciousness, right? It's because of the fact that movements in the streets, not just making arguments or making pleas or demanding things, movements in the streets insisting that they wouldn't leave, insisting that these questions need to be taken seriously, and putting forward arguments for how to defund the police and refund communities, we're really, really had the upper hand. Now, backlash is inevitable, and we should know that, and we should be prepared for it. And that's what we're seeing. We've seen every structure of government and every media, organization pushing back as hard as possible against defunding, all fueled by an argument which is absolutely false, which is that the dramatic increase in many cities of violence, violent crime in particular, and homicide here in Philadelphia, this is undeniable. It has absolutely nothing to do with defunding, right? And so it's actually an excuse to not think about the very same questions we're raising, right? Which is about socioeconomic equality, about alternatives, about whether or not our communities are taking care of people, right? It has to do with things we don't want to ask ourselves about COVID. What happens when the kids are not in school? What happens when they're supposed to be in school but they're out in the corner? What happens when teenagers and older people are forced to move back in with their family? What happens when they have no economic opportunities, right? And no opportunities for recognition and status in their community as a result, right? And what happens when the increase in the drug trade is exponential because everyone's at home, and wants to order their drugs online and have people deliver them? What does that mean for the way that networks? No, but I mean, it's a concrete question for like the way that networks of, what we call gangs, so-called gangs, or drug organizations or others operate on a community level, right? And competition for those markets. All of these are important questions, right? Defunding didn't cause any of this. And so part of what we need to do in what is necessarily a moment of pushback on the abolitionist project is to hold the line, to put forward strong arguments for defunding, to say that, listen, of course, the point is never to make communities less safe. The point is that we need to start from a position where we recognize that, for example, here in West Philadelphia, communities have gotten very unsafe, right? And we don't get anywhere by saying that we simply need to withdraw the police, right? We should do that, but we also need to, establish alternative community power structures that are able to keep people safe.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let me, I guess, bring myself in so that I guess I can be seen as well. No, fantastic conversation so far. And yeah, no, Geo, what you're bringing to the fore is just really, really important and critically, prescient, given, like you said, the very real material conditions that people are dealing with. Again, we're dealing, in a socioeconomic era where, billions of dollars can be sent to pro-fascist, pro-Nazi, literal Nazi forces in the Ukraine. But in the same vein, again, the material conditions in the United States continue to deteriorate, rapidly, which is not, and some folks will then try to situate that as an argument for the legitimacy of the United States. And it's like, no, absolutely not. And I'm actually thinking of another colleague and comrade of ours, Nick Estes from the Red Nation. And I just finished reading his book, Our History is the Future, which can't see, but one of the things he said in here, I was thinking about as you were talking about a little passage from him that I'll read briefly, and then also something from Amos Wilson, late sociologist and organizer as well. But one of the things that Nick says in this book, this is in the last chapter called Liberation. He says that ancestors of indigenous resistance didn't merely fight against settler colonialism. They fought for indigenous life in just relations with human and non-human relatives and with the earth. When Custer and his men descended on the sun dance at Greasy Grass, the ancestors were dancing, as they have since time immemorial, to make the tree of life in Black Elk's vision bloom, and to ensure the rebirth of their people and the earth. In 2016, as construction of the Black Snake, the Dakota Access Pipeline, began, they danced again, this time on the shores at Oceti-Sakowin Camp and the Sacred Stone to protect Minnesota or the Missouri River and Grandmother Earth. Indigenous resistance is not a one-time event. It continually asks, what proliferates in the absence of empire? Thus, it defines freedom not as the absence of settler colonialism, but as the amplified presence of indigenous life in just relations with human and non-human relatives and with the earth. And then that had me think of, in Amos Wilson's book, Falsifying African Consciousness, Eurocentric History, Psychiatry, and the Politics of White Supremacy, there's a section in there called Procedural Liberties and Personal Restraints. And I'll share that and then I'll close my mouth. It says, the Constitution of this nation guarantees what we call procedural liberties, while not guaranteeing what we call the real nitty-gritty substantial liberties. What do we mean by that? It guarantees that certain procedures will be followed, that we can go to court, that we will be heard, and of course there's quotations around these things, before a so-called jury of our peers and so forth. But does it guarantee a freedom from hunger? Does it guarantee housing, healthcare, and true education? Does it guarantee full employment? Does it guarantee safe working conditions? Does it guarantee a non-polluted earth? Does it guarantee true equality and equal distribution of resources? The Constitution does not guarantee any of that. It guarantees us certain procedural rights and rules. It says that if we can go to court the same way that rich people go to court, that we can be heard in a court of law, that we must be read our Miranda rights upon request. But there's a difference between procedure and what actually happens. Certainly we may be read our rights, maybe. And certainly we may go to court, but without money to pay for a good lawyer, belonging to the wrong ethnic group, belonging to the wrong class, while we may go through procedures, that does not guarantee justice. And like you're saying, this piece of, fomenting and continuing what we already have, as Jack O'Dell once talked about, that even on your last point there, that, it is, more important to control the institutional levers of power than it is to make the 6 o'clock news. And so in this era where it is so easy for folks to spew radical rhetoric while participating in anti-radical ideology, I think it's important, just the things that you were raising, to be clear about where folks are and what is going on. So I don't know if either of you want to respond to any of that or none of that. And if not, we can, okay, I see people in the chat, but we can open it up for questions and workshops.
I'll just say very quickly, because it's, I appreciate that you raised that point. When you hear procedural freedoms, right? like you should think right back to, of course, the negative piece of abolition, right? Which is that you tear down an institution, you establish a very formal, in other words, on paper equality, and you don't build anything else, right? You don't reconstruct society from the bottom. You don't create an alternative. That corresponds to what we'd often call negative freedoms, right? We have a freedom from, instead of a positive freedom to healthcare, to equality, to jobs, to justice, right? The idea that we actually deserve, these things. And the reason I wanted to step in and say that is because if you fast forward, you have this bizarre situation in which one of the main reforms, so-called police reforms being offered by Obama in particular, was what's called procedural justice. And it's a strange thing, right? And you try to like wrap your head around what it means. Roughly what it means is that, they want to reform the police so that communities believe that they will be treated fairly by the police, right? But they don't do that by saying, let's change what police do, right? They do that by a whole bunch of ideological maneuvers, the point of which is that the goal is for people to see the police differently. It's not for the police to do different things, right? It's to trick communities into thinking that the police are being fair and equal with them, even when they aren't.
No, absolutely. Absolutely spot on. Absolutely spot on, for sure. And particularly, Dignity in Schools members and organizers are really familiar with that, with the whole like officer friendly. I remember I was a kid that went to school in the late 90s and early 2000s, and like DARE programs and all that kind of jazz, and all of the stuff that was meant to again change the relationship. And even in terms of popular media, shows that valorize policing, like you said, we live in this social milieu, if you will, where it's like an ontological norm, and that therefore it's also necessarily good. So even if there's some issues here and there, ultimately the through line is, no, this is what we need. And of course, the we in that case is the capitalist class, or what Glenn Ford talked about as the predator class, to really just continue to be a force, the material force that continues to enforce the system that then extracts resources and labor and capital and all of that kind of stuff for people to go to the moon, to go with Jeff Bezos, while again, we trying to grow some kale on the ground here. But I think this is a really rich conversation, and want to, again, open it up to members. This is a chance where I know we have a few questions in the chat, but there can be some more if anyone wants to come in and speak to Geo or ask the question and verbalize it. Definitely just raise your hand in the chat, and I can do that and bring you to the fold, and you say, hey, comment, question, all of that kind of stuff. Because again, this is really a space for us to collaborate and work together. There is one question that comes from Paul Lasso that says, is there any data on social economic conditions that lead to increases or decreases in crimes committed by the working class, especially violent crime? Example, muggings before or after recessions. Yeah. And so I don't know if you want to take that, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I'm not, I can't point you to specific statistics. We know that there's a correlation, right? We know that there's a relationship. We know that when people don't have what they need, they're more likely to, of course, engage in the kind of crime that gets them what they need, right? Whether it's robbing, mugging, or shoplifting, right? Or the kinds of so-called crimes that really don't create social harm, right? Stealing from large corporations, looting. Looting in the course of a rebellion. And so these are all, of course, correlated to it. The important thing to bear in mind, though, is that these things are what you call multivariate, right? There are so many different pieces to explaining, for example, why the homicide rate in Philadelphia has shot up. Really, it's higher than it's ever been. And there are many, many pieces, right? We have to think in complicated and complex ways about how these pieces fit together, right? About how the lack of activities for the youth correspond to lack of economic opportunities, correspond to, honestly, and I didn't mention this earlier, a general desensitization to mass death, which we've undergone during the course of this pandemic, right? It's like if you see people dying all around you, of course, you're more likely to risk it all, in the possibility of getting some short-term benefit. So it's complicated. That's the first thing to say. The second thing I'll say is that these kinds of things are sticky. And by that, I mean that you could, this comes out, I know it from the Venezuelan context as well, where it's like, poverty creates violence and creates crime. Yes. But if you immediately remove that poverty, that violence and crime doesn't immediately disappear. Why? Because people get involved in organizational relationships, they get involved in criminal organizations, they get involved in neighborhood patterns, they begin to think about themselves in certain ways and get involved in habits and certain behaviors, right? And so that takes more work, right? That takes more community work. It's not simply a socioeconomic thing where as soon as everyone in the neighborhood has economic opportunities, they're going to choose to sort of be, so-called productive community members, right? It's a lot more than that. And the rebuilding of community fabric, I think, takes a lot more work on a lot of different, levels.
Oh, good stuff. Good stuff. Good stuff. Andrew, would you like to add anything to that? Or
I think you both lifted up, right? I really appreciate not just the absence of, but the presence of, and, thinking about race and class solidarity. Black folks, poor folks across US history have demonstrated the answers in their community engagement, right? We see it from the Reconstruction era, as you lifted up, Geo, to the Civil Rights Movement, to this era of Black Lives Matter, that Black people have more problem-solving skills, Black children have more problem-solving skills than any of these carceral solutions offered in the forms of prisons or policing. And so I think it's kind of continually pushing that logical narrative, right? That the police do not serve, right? They are descendants of slave patrols and the protection of white people's private property and union busting. And to say, particularly in the school context, they are only there to brutalize and terrorize Black and brown kids, LGBTQ young people, and kids with disabilities. And then to say, not only is that the reality, but these kids are showing us in real time how they are organizing, how they are lifting up their voices, creating the community-based solutions that are required. And hopefully, as we continue this narrative deep into the 21st century around abolition, those examples of community-based solutions offered up by young people in particular will be highlighted and kind of usher in this new era.
no, indeed, absolutely. Reminds me of something that when I do conflict resolution training in another line of work, and one of the first things we often say at those sessions is that most folks already know how to resolve conflict. Kind of like you were saying at the top, and we'll get a whiteboard and say, okay, when you want to resolve a conflict, what are the things that you do? And we'll make a list of things and all that. And when you try to resolve conflict and it doesn't work out, what are some things that occur? And we look at that, and so we kind of, okay, well, we already know what works, we already know what doesn't work. Now it's getting into the details of that work. And so like you're saying, Andrew and Geo, just building up those kinds of spaces and institutions and relationships and prioritizing them that are very anti-capitalist, because again, especially in the work that at least Andrew, you and I are tied to in some ways, that, the nonprofit industrial complex itself also, reinforces the status quo about trying to, again, extract, how would I put it? Trying to extract really symbolic reforms and then calling that like the freedom struggle. And then when we recognize, again, I call it kind of like a treadmill politics, where like we run a lot and get tired and burnt out, but we haven't gone anywhere materially. And I think that that's an important thing, and particularly for, younger organizers to recognize too, that it's if it were just a matter of having the right ideas, then we'd be free by now. That it were just a matter of it's like, no, there is an actual force of folks that do not want these kinds of ideas to proliferate, because as I'm thinking about the work of Eugene Puryear, and one of the things he had mentioned is like, for a certain class of people, the capitalist class, it's not enough to have an Olympic-sized swimming pool that has to be heated as well. And so in those kinds of, it's a tongue-in-cheek thing, but it's absolutely true when we look at the material conditions. You're in Philadelphia, Andrew, I think you're in Austin, I'm in Chicago, and we all, yeah, like just we could get into that at a whole nother level. But I do have a question for you, Geo, to kind of tease out a little bit, because we are talking a lot about your work, and I'm a little more familiar with it than some folks in the conversation may be. So I would love for you to feel free to like stretch out a little bit in terms of some of your internationalist organizing work. Again, Andrew and I, before you came on, we were both talking about how, folks in organizing traditions, particularly in nonprofit spaces, are so afraid of words like socialism and communism, and cutting those things off from, ideological arenas of struggle. And then again, we end up with these status quo systems, to borrow from Jared Ball, quoting someone else who I can't remember, said something to the effect of like, we don't know who discovered the water, but we know it wasn't the fish, for an all pervasive environment is always just beyond perception. And so organizing and existing under a capitalist frame, and that being normalized is like, that's just life in reality, when we know that that's not the case. It is this brutal engineering of a society. Geo, I would love for you to kind of like chat a little bit about, talking about abolition, talking about policing, capitalism, social, like, trying to formulate a question, but I would love for you to kind of
there's two pieces I think that are really important, and they're historically connected, right? Which is that so when we talk about abolition, we get our language very much from the US context, right? It's usually about, abolition, the abolition of slavery was a global phenomenon, right? The Haitian Revolution was one of the most important moments in that, because that's slaves liberating themselves as slaves liberated themselves in the US context, right? But we tend to get our language from the US context. We tend to think in the framework of white supremacy in the US, the legacies of chattel slavery, and we tend to think of those as slightly divorced from the rest of the world, right? One important thing to remember is that while there's millions of people coming into the conversation of abolition today, and being introduced to it and embracing it, and beginning to figure out what that means for them, the old heads and the sort of shining and leading lights of abolitionist movements, often if we're talking about Ruthie Gilmore or Robin D. G. Kelly or Angela Davis, these are socialists, communists, and they are internationalists, right? These are people who understood that, for example, the struggle for Black liberation in the United States was always bound up with the anti-colonial struggle, the struggle against colonial domination, the struggle against imperialism, and the struggle for socialism elsewhere. And there are always people for whom, for example, I talk a lot about self-defense in this book, but self-defense was historically part of the Black struggle that's kind of fallen out of the abolitionist framework a little bit and needs to be reincorporated. And when we look to global struggles against policing, we find that self-defense, of course, is an essential part of that, right? Keeping the community safe. So for me, a lot of this research began, way back when I was doing work in Venezuela during the Bolivarian Revolution under Hugo Chavez. In other words, an attempt to fully rebuild a society, reconstruct a society of equals, and to do so in a context that was in many ways very dangerous, very violent, very subject to neoliberalism, austerity, poverty, and all of the violence that brings with it. And one of the first movements that I really spent a lot of time with and organizing with and understanding and studying were these movements for self-defense on a local level. Right? People that came together and said, listen, we want the drug dealers out of this neighborhood and the violence that they bring, but we also know the police are not helping us, and the police are part of the problem. The police are part of the drug trade. The police are part of the violence in our communities, right? Even when they're not engaging in it directly, they're part of this system, right? And so these were organizations that got together, they picked up 2x4s or weapons or guns or sticks or whatever they had at hand and took control of their community, right? And they did so often in democratic ways, in collective ways, through assemblies and discussions about how we're going to manage this community. And then those conversations sort of gave rise to more ambitious demands, right? Like, we need a basketball court over here for the kids, or we need a new road here. And so they could make demands of the government when it was the Chavez government as well, and they kept control of their local territory. And so I was, going to graduate school at UC Berkeley, living in Oakland, and going back and forth to Venezuela. Then I began to be struck by the fact that what communities were demanding in Caracas and Venezuela was the same as what the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California historically was demanding, right? It was not only the, pushing the police out of the community and oversight over the police, but it was also providing, of course, meal programs for kids. It was also walking elders to the bus to make sure that they got there safely, right? So they were not subjected to violence. And it was also about trying to build the kind of community power and community solidarity that would not require the police. And so from the beginning, I didn't really see a difference between what it was that people were demanding in Venezuela or Mexico or other parts of the world and what people were demanding in the US. I think a lot of these divisions are false, are upheld, by often honestly academics and intellectuals and less by movements themselves, right? We see movements, BLM engaging in solidarity with Standing Rock, engaging in solidarity with border struggles and against Border Patrol and ICE, and in solidarity with Palestine, more than we see sort of the movements themselves wanting to uphold these kind of false distinctions. And so deepening these structures of internationalist and socialist solidarity is essential.
Facts, indeed. Marlene, I see that you have your hand up, so I am going to move you to a panelist. Let's see if Marlene is still in the fold. Oh, where did she go? Marlene, can you hear us if you are still in the chat? I thought I saw you. There we go. Marlene, I saw that your hand was raised. Did you want to jump in and say or add anything? And you can unmute yourself if you would like. Maybe not. Well, along the way, no, I think that point is so important because we're so encouraged here to look at things as single issue people and say, oh, just focus on the education justice movement. Just focus on police out of schools, just focus on the environment, just focus on electoral politics, just focus on this, that, and the third, when really it is in their interconnectedness. And we look at, all of our, even from the Haitian Revolution as an example, I'm thinking about Simon Bolivar, and, everything that happens in, Central and South America because of the stone that gets tossed into the water with the Haitian Revolution, and how Haiti then becomes this beacon and still punished to this day by the international Western European community in the United States, so on and so forth, for winning, frankly. And how people talk about the threat of a good example. I'm thinking about folks like Maurice Bishop and the New Jewel movement in Grenada as well. And these end up becoming really, we're encouraged away from these places. But again, like you're saying, when we look at communities and people and what they're building and articulating, it's like some of the most humane and ecologically resilient, environmentally sustainable opportunities for human flourishing. Because capitalism is a system that is pro-profit and anti-people, pro-profit and anti-life. And I think that if we don't, beyond the catchphrase of that, if we don't, integrate that and deepen our knowledge of not just critiques of that, but other modalities of being, then again, the institutions that we have, be it education, law, growing food, entertainment, all of them, again, end up being socialized within that capitalist, profit-driven, heteronormative, white patriarchal way of doing things. And then again, we might, as an elder that I know says, slap some kente cloth on it, but it's still an oppressive institution if we haven't undone and then redone those kinds of things. And so, no, I think you're bringing to the fold, Geo, is very, very poignant. Were you about to jump in and say something, Andrew, or no? I don't want to put you on the spot. And y'all know me, I'm not one to let a meeting go longer than it needs to. So if Geo has solved all of the problems and we're good, then, just, share the notes and, meet me at the spot and we can make it happen. No, but so yeah, I guess we can, if there are no other questions, we can start to transition towards a closing. And the question that I have for you, Geo, and Andrew, definitely feel free to chime in as well. What do you see ahead of us? And what I mean by that is, we're all involved in various organizations and relations, locally, nationally, internationally, so on and so forth. But thinking about, since this conversation has been around police and breaking police power effectively, where do you see the struggle taking shape now? What are some things you're maybe excited about? Maybe some things that you are concerned about? Any of that, Andrew or Geo, towards something movement folks should be aware of?
The national landscape is a bit tricky, right? We're dealing with the aftermath of January 6th. Most acutely, we're dealing with the slow march to the 2024 presidential election, which I think all of us anticipate might go a certain way and have a re-entry into the White House. But in this time where we have still dealt with the significant impact of the pandemic, where folks have seen this mass death for 2.5 years and really had to, not even be given the proper amount of time to take it in and fully grasp it. There are some community networks like Dignity in Schools and other formations that are really prioritizing, I think, the healing of Black and brown folks in this moment and their leadership and expertise in getting us to this new and better world that we're trying to achieve. But yeah, I'm trying to hold, and this is the type of duality, unfortunately, that we are kind of given in 2022, right? Where I think there are challenging pieces ahead of us, right? Ecological collapse and climate change and white supremacy unchecked, and kind of using the boogeyman, as we were talking about, Tafari, of words like socialism and communism that actually would get us to, I think, more sustainable, healthy communities across the globe. But yeah, I'm leaning in this moment on coalitions like Dignity in Schools, like, local organizing collectives. They're saying, oh no, defund is absolutely still a demand, and it's defund to abolish, right? We're still holding electeds accountable for that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, this was kind of a rambling answer, but yeah, I hold hope, right? I feel Miriam deeply when she says that hope is a discipline. I believe that in my bones, but I'm also not naive about the challenges ahead, and just I'm trying to brace myself alongside all of us for them.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And thank you for opening up, Andrew, the broader panorama of questions, right? And I think there's a lot to bear in mind, right? And there's a lot that we could say about it. We're living on very troubled waters. We're doing our best to navigate against strong breezes, and it becomes difficult to hold all of these things stable at once. You brought up January 6th, right? Which is incredibly complicated, right? Because first of all, I'm a big fan of insurrection, right? Big fan of seditious conspiracy. Like, these things do not trouble me, right? The problem with January 6th, of course, was not that it was a conspiracy or an insurrection. It was that it was a white supremacist pogrom, right? And if we were storming the Capitol, I would have no trouble with it whatsoever, because the direction that we would be pushing that is toward greater equality, greater democracy, the expansiveness of this sort of abolition democracy as something that will promise those substantial things. But what we're getting instead is, on the one hand, the resurgence of overt fascism, which is a powerful force. It hasn't gone away. It's been splintered during and since the Trump years, but this also means there's a lot more fascists out there wandering around without a leader, right? And so this is something we need to be acutely aware of, especially as this violence is on the uptick, against communities and sort of overt racist attacks. Simultaneously, though, we have a Democratic Party that is really trying to bully everyone back into the institutions, right? So the narrative of the Democratic Party is that the problem with Trump is that he was against the institutions, or he disrupted the norms. The norms and the institutions have been the problem, right? The Constitution is a problem, the Supreme Court is a problem, the FBI is a problem, and yet these have all been presented to us as saviors, right? The FBI was going to save us from Trump. Anyone who studies and knows anything about the Black Power movement, of course, knows that the FBI destroyed the Black Power movement and will continue to do so. And so we need to push back on this idea that the meaning of January 6th, but also the meaning of the Trump years, is that we need to reinforce and uphold the institutions, right? And to insist that those institutions are a problem, right? Part of the story, a major part of the story about January 6th should be how many cops were there, right? How many cops were there being willing to beat other cops to death, right? And that shows a sort of deep fracture, within this sort of right-wing community that needs to be understood, that needs to be exploited, and that needs to be used and leveraged for more pressure against the police, right? More pressure against, imperialism and global policing. And this is kind of some of the directions that we need to push these things. These things will play out, of course, different locally, right? If it's Chicago or Texas or Pennsylvania, we're looking at different constellations, right? Here in Philly, we've got actually a pretty strong abolitionist movement. We've managed to defend a progressive DA, Larry Krasner, who's not perfect, but who has been able to, who has been able to fight off attacks from the right, unlike people like, unfortunately, Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, other progressive, district attorneys, who have been struggling to survive amid this backlash, right? We need to be able to push outward on those, expand our abolitionist movements, not just through elections, and not even really mostly through elections, but through, the power of movements in the streets, and again, hold the line when it comes to defunding, hold the line when it comes to putting forward the argument that, you know what, it is not defunding that is making our communities less safe. It's policing that is making our communities less safe right now. And we need to be pushing these arguments, pushing these movements, and building, again, building real alternatives. These alternatives, as things get worse and more complicated, these alternatives need to become very concrete, right? These communities that can defend each other need to be cohesive communities. And also they need to know how to grow food, and they need to know how to engage in relationships with rural America and build out, territory and liberated territories, on the model of, what's going on near and around Jackson and other places, in terms of community, self-sustainability, right? These are the kind of things that we need to be building and expanding. Again, schools are a great place to start when it comes to policing, understanding that schools, there's no way to think about these questions without thinking about the broader questions, right? Why? Because police in elite white suburban schools are ostensibly there to protect the students from the outside world, right? Meaning scary outsiders, or if it's a school that's located in an urban area from communities of color, ironically, or, it's not really that ironic, we know that they don't actually protect them either. In Parkland, the school massacre, the school resource officer hid for 45 minutes. He didn't, help the students, he didn't protect them, and the law found that he wasn't required to have done so. So we should know that. But on the other hand, when we're pushing police out of schools in poor communities, in communities where the targets are the students themselves, right? The targets of discipline, the targets of repression, the targets of exploitation, is an attempt to discipline a future labor force or a future prison population, right? This is what many of these school resource officers are there for. And we need to be fighting hard battles to get those officers removed from schools entirely. And to get alternatives created, whether official alternatives and new counselors and others, but also outside alternatives, student organizations, as you mentioned, which I think is a great strategy for building student power, and parent organizations, community organizations in conjunction with these schools, so that because kids get out of school and they go home to the same community that they exist in their school. And so these are the kind of questions I think that need to be at the forefront of this organizing. And it's always building and tearing down at the same time. We need to be prepared to do both.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Thank you both so much for all of that and all that you've shared and the work that you've done. Thank you so much to folks in the chat for your questions, for the conversation. And again, the conversation is really, this is a beginning. One of the things I always love to say is if you heard something that you like, please share it with 3 people that weren't here. Let's, again, make community a practice versus just an ideal. So often we end up in silos with people that we already agree with, talking about things that we already agree on. And while that is important, there is also more people to win in terms of the ideological struggle towards materializing the very institutions that Geo and Andrew are talking about. And that and again, the fortunate thing about this is, this is a virtual room of organizers. Folks are doing that work. And so my hope and my wish leaving from here is that you all have heard something that was meaningful to you, that struck you with a chord, that wanted you to dig deeper into something. And please follow that inspiration and interest. Look for the connections. Look for the networks, look for both of our communities and also of the institutions that are holding us back from what we're trying to do. And so again, this has been a part of the Week of Action, the Dignity in Schools National Week of Action Against School Pushout. Our theme this year, again, is building schools our communities deserve, which really, again, means, schools being institutions of community. We're really talking about building communities that our people deserve. And our people deserve a world without police, a world with access to healthy, quality food, to buildings that don't have lead and asbestos in them, and teachers that look like them, that aren't afraid to, on days like today, bring up stuff and work from folks like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, and so on and so forth. And so, we really can have what we want if we organize for it. So I hope that this is a good charge to continue organizing, continue political education, continue making coalitions, networks, and conversations, and that this Week of Action Against School Pushout is really just a space to charge up and continue doing some of that work. And so, again, I want to say thank you, Geo, thank you, Andrew, thank you to the attendees. There will be a link for this that can be shared out publicly, so please do that as well. And if there's nothing else, that is it, and that is all, y'all. So thank you so much again, and enjoy the sounds on your way out.
I was born with small access to big dreams and detached homes and lazy boy couches with fit thrones that with sick kings, lion statues on the fences larger than the castles they guarded. Lawns made the pastures pristine, erased with the have-nots, broke with the moats where the Jags parked, doing dirty work with the whips clean. Notice the Joneses, ordered what they have is for the show, and even notices on doors of foreclosures. I'm trying to get income and then some, right around in something. The system bumping, the disc jumping, I'm rolling. A slight high from being able to buy what you shouldn't, but you never do why. Never mind, it's the feeling I've been wanting for time. Flying blind to a wall, strong drawing to shine. I just looked at the pictures. Didn't have a manual to build this, just assembled it from feeling. Looking at pictures. I was given tools meant for building, with no instructions for the wielding. Look at the picture. Ain't even close to the description, and yet it's working as a wish thing. Looking at pictures, and even though parts of it are missing, it's still completing the depiction. Started off trying to make a wave, then I made a wave that made a wage that laid a waste the paper chase that I was in the race. But how you even stop this thing? I never learned, so return, I'ma burn out brakes. Spin it faster than the churn out makes, but I'm a phoenix. I went from ashes to classes, shoebox to plastic. Credit come by whatever imagined. Developing habits I can't kick. Man, I was rocking cleats to a max full of baskets. Fast break, broke the safe trying to basket. Sums that wasn't real, but ones and nils, and they asking. Debit and credit the latter, please. Climbing into debt without a sweat when it's gradually. Had to make a couple mistakes that I couldn't erase. Overdrawn, but I turned out great. I just looked at the pictures. Didn't have a manual to build this, just assembled it from feeling. Looking at pictures. I was given tools meant for building, with no instructions for the wielding. Look at the picture. Ain't even close to the description, and yet it's working as a wish thing. Looking at pictures, and even though parts of it are missing, it's still completing the depiction. I maneuver by example, good or bad, try as a trample. Something I couldn't grasp but wouldn't pass. I would rather struggle than simple of what I can do. Look at that, a little different, but the difference is make it what it isn't. Is whatever I want to witness. Behold the vision outside of the city limits, where time is more value than money for the spending. Ascending to deeper things, never knew reason in. Throwing random spices in the life of the season in. Without a silver spoon, I couldn't taste what I was prepping. My guesses made it wouldn't whip a problem to a question. Why do my people spend more and have less and no seat to eat the meal that we responsible for chefing? Imagine in the window was just a mirror reflection. I turned the sideline into a seat at the concession. I just looked at the pictures. Didn't have a manual to build this, just assembled it from feeling. Looking at pictures. I was given tools meant for building, with no